Hello and welcome to another edition of 9 to 5 Live. This morning's subject is private equity opportunities in the Balkans. And here to discuss that with us is Gavin Ryan. Gavin is well known in the private equity space. Gavin is an expert on mid-cap private equity opportunities in emerging markets, and he's a consultant to the World Bank on this subject. Gavin, hello.
Hello, nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Nice to meet you, and thanks for joining us. Could I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, my basic background is an emerging markets fund manager. So I was an emerging markets fund manager in Central Europe from about the late 90s through to 2015. I managed three funds, one based in Zagreb, where I lived for several years. Then subsequently, I managed a very successful fund called the European Equity Fund, which was a $200 million fund investing throughout Southeast Europe. And I was based in Belgrade for that. And after that, I moved to Vienna to manage a renewable energy fund. Since 2015, I've worked as an expert and consultant for private equity in emerging markets, and one of my main roles has been as a World Bank consultant.
Now, my main reason for reaching out to you was I noticed a LinkedIn post that you did a few days ago mentioning that you were organizing a conference in Tirana, Albania, on the private equity market in uh, Albania and Northern Macedonia. I think we'll describe it
Yeah,
like that. And That's
yeah,
that's
Albania,
what
North
led to
Macedonia, and Kosovo. Let's say the three countries that contain a large Albanian population. And the reason this initiative came about is that in my work for the World Bank, I wrote quite a few reports about the private equity markets in several emerging countries, such as North Macedonia, Georgia, and various others. And these reports are all very thorough and well made. Unfortunately, they remained confidential within the World Bank. And I was really keen to do something which I could share more widely. So, in my own private capacity, I decided, along with some colleagues of mine in Albania from a firm called CBS, I decided to create a report on those three countries. And the reason for that is, as a Southeast European fund manager, I felt that the Albanian kind of zone of it, let's say, had been quite neglected. You see quite a lot of private equity activity in Croatia. The Slovenia's had quite a bit in Serbia, but those particular areas have been quite neglected, and I wanted to bring people's attention to the potential that was there.
when is this conference taking place? Can you tell us a little
Yeah,
bit
so the
about how
conference
many
so the
people?
conference is organised primarily by USAID, and it's a kind of regional investment conference, and it's going to be on the 24th and 25th of June in Tirana. Location to be decided, but probably a major hotel. And as part of this conference, I'm going to be presenting the conclusions of my report, which was about 2 years in the making, and also participate in a panel discussion on the prospects for private equity in the region.
How many people are you expecting at this conference?
Several hundred, I would say, all the people who are active in the investment financial community in I would say North Macedonia, Albania, Kosovo, and probably further afield. There are probably people from Croatia, Serbia, and some international people with an interest in the region, as well as donors and developmental financial institution representatives. So I would say several hundred.
Will can I leave some kind of contact details for you, like a website or something where people will be able to say hello, reach out to you, ask details about the conference, and ask you if you'll have time for a coffee during the conference, tap you on the shoulder and introduce themselves. Would that be a good
Yeah,
idea?
absolutely. I'll provide you with the details so that you can post those, and I'll be happy to respond to people reaching out to me.
When we're talking about mid-cap opportunities, what are we really talking about? Can you define that, please?
Yeah, I mean, a mid-cap world is really driven by the size of a fund. So when I'm talking about mid-cap private equity in the context of Southeast Europe, I mean, in Western Europe, it's going to be proportionally bigger because economies are bigger. But in the context of Southeast Europe, mid-cap private equity will mean a fund of a size of about 30 million euros through to about 100 million euros or so. And those funds will be targeting investment sizes between 1 to 10 million euros per investment, which is broadly mid-cap and lower mid-cap.
How does Albania and Northern Macedonia compare to other emerging markets in this space?
Well, they are. If we look, what we should look at is the income level per capita. So those are all middle income countries, so, and their population sizes are in the region of 2 to 8 million. So that's fairly typical of all the Western Balkan countries. And so a country like Albania has a population of 3 million. I don't remember the precise figure for the GDP per capita, but it's a few $1,000s, and it's quite comparable to say to Moldova, to Georgia, to Armenia. It's somewhat lower. It's same in population size than Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, but much lower in terms of GDP per capita. And so you can look at all these comparable countries in population sizes and use them as models and anticipate how the market could develop. And that was a lot of my work at the World Bank, is I'll be looking at, when I'll be analysing countries, say, for example, like Georgia, where I was recently working, I would look at what's going on in Armenia, Azerbaijan, in Jamaica, another mid-cap country, and you'd have lessons and learns and patterns you can see of development, and it helps you to better understand how the market's going to develop.
Has there been any research on the impact of private equity and VC on emerging markets?
Yes, plenty of research. I mean, a large body of research can be found from Invest Europe, which is the European Venture Capital Association, and they publish things that are freely available to people. And there's been a lot of research done on that by the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, USAID, among others. And these developmental agencies all have websites, and there's a lot of material you can download quite for free. And it is a bit of a patchwork, but there's a lot of analysis there. OECD, I could also mention, does a lot of work on SME development in these different countries. And then finally, I could mention the Barcelona Business School, IESE, that publishes a very interesting country rating system for private equity and venture capital, which rates 129 countries as attractive or not for private equity and venture capital. So that's just a snapshot of a few of them.
Can you give us an example of your work in Albania and Northern Macedonia in the last few years?
Yeah, so in Northern Macedonia, I did quite a bit of work for the World Bank in the venture capital space. And my work there was an expert to help support the development of incubators, so the venture capital space and startups. And that took quite a bit of my time. It was involved in giving recommendations to the government on how to improve the ecosystem and training fund managers, mostly. In Albania, it consisted of working on developing a new fund and performing due diligence on potential investments and companies and meeting lots of companies and various other things. So I did a mixture of different things in the countries over the last 5 years.
The report that you've used for presenting to the World Bank and you'll be using in the conference in Tirana, what are the findings of the report? I don't expect you to give the full details because that's obviously something you want to hold off for the conference itself. But can you give us an overview of what your findings are?
Well, the report is my own intellectual property. It's nothing to do with the World Bank, although I have drawn upon my know-how from the World Bank to create the report. So it does use some of the methodologies, but it's a report done out of my own initiative and my Albanian colleagues. And so, I'll be able to share it in the way that I see fit, rather than sitting in a drawer somewhere, which is, I think, a good thing for the ecosystem. And so my plan is to present the essential findings of this report at the conference. But some of the findings we're going to present are going to be things like that. We've made an estimate of the annual demand for private equity, the unmet annual demand for private equity in the region of Albania, North Macedonia, Kosovo, which is in the tens of millions of dollars. We've also looked at what are some of the impediments towards the creation of new fund management firms, and try to take a general look. We talked to a lot of the fund managers who operate in the region. We talked to a lot of the major banks who lend in the region, and we talked to about 100. We surveyed about 100 companies, and I also went and did some due diligence on some others. So we really tried to go in depth and to base our report on primary research that we had performed rather than secondary research. And so I like to think the report is quite thorough. And I think the ultimate conclusion of my report is that we simply need to create more fund managers, because there's often money there available for investment, and there is demand by SMEs for investment. And the bottleneck is the supply of talented fund managers who can actually put the two together. And that's what is often overlooked when people talk about the private equity markets. They talk about it too much in the abstract, and you have to start with the centrality figure of the fund manager and how you create a fund manager.
Are you finding, for instance, in the case of Albania, that there are those who have been expatriates in say London or other private equity places of expertise, and then they go back to their country and bring the expertise they have, or is it really homegrown talent that is learning its role within Albania itself?
Well, I recently created two new fund management firms in Jamaica, which is another country that has a lot of a diaspora across the world. And I've also worked a lot with Armenia and Nigeria. And these, again, are countries where you have this strong diaspora that comes back and forth. And the idea of that bringing back somebody from somewhere to sort of become a fund manager is valid, but it's complicated. Once you sort of scratch below the surface, and the complication is due to where people are in their lives. So it's relatively easy to bring back a 20-something-year-old who's done a couple of years in London, bring him back to Albania with a little bit of knowledge he may have acquired, but that's not enough to become a proper fund manager. On the other hand, the people you really might want to bring back, who are in their maybe late 30s, 40s, are very hard to move because they have school-aged children and maybe a wife who's not from the region and are reluctant to move, or they try to fly back and forth, which is often complicated. The third demographic you can bring back is the guy in the mid-50s plus who's sort of semi-retired, who wants to bring something back, who's perhaps made his money. So you have to sort of be, it's a bit more complicated in practice when you try and really make it happen. But I have done that. For example, we set up a fund in Armenia I was involved in, where a guy in his 50s who had a very successful career as an investment bank in the US came back. But it isn't as simple as it appears, but it is a big source of possibilities, yes.
What do you think the future for this region is in terms of private equity and venture capital?
Well, I think the future for them is the European Union. I think the European Union is what's going to drive the economic development, is going to drive their political and social stability. And if we look specifically at the private equity industry, for example, we can see that at the moment, North Macedonia, Kosovo and Albania has already done it, but they're all putting in place new legislation for private equity and venture capital. And what have they done? They've basically taken the European Union Private Equity Directive of 2011, which is the kind of gold standard for regulation of private equity, and they more or less cut and pasted it back in their home countries. So that's, I think, is a good move because it will make the environment much more familiar for the rest of the Europeans, potential investors and others.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all we're going to have time for today. If you can give us some news on your conference and more details, I'll be happy to share those in the comments just below the video. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, I will. Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to seeing you at the conference.
Thank you, Gavin. Bye-bye.